Again, same rules apply. We'll have each of you introduce yourself and hear the rules in 90 seconds, and we'll begin off my right shoulder. Please state your name, the office you're seeking, and then answer the following question. What do you think are the most important solutions at the city level to address sea level rise, city county level to address sea level rise and flooding? Sir?
My name is Emmanuel G. Morel. I'm a candidate for County Commission District 2. What needs to happen as it pertains to the question is eventually we're going to have to retreat. No one talks about it. Everyone thinks that it will take care of itself. I remember as a young man in college, and I heard then Congressman Al Gore talking about climate change. And I'm like, what is he talking about? And here we are. Here we are. Frankly, what I believe now is that climate change is real. We are very vulnerable. We will all pay for it if we don't take it seriously. And to those on the coast, I say it's time to start retreating. And I believe the county must take action. And if they can't, don't ask me to subsidize those folks on the coast. Don't ask me to get more to pay for the dirt to nourish. No, they need to start getting out of there, because eventually we're going to lose this battle. Thank you.
Ma'am?
My name is Sylvia Sharps. I'm running for Palm Beach County Commission District 2, just like the two gentlemen to my left and right. Number one, we need to sound the alarm and get people to understand that it is a critical reality, period. It is actually happening. If you watch the ice caps, they are actually falling off faster than they ever have before. So it's real. It's not a made-up thing, like the president would like to pretend. And then we need to prepare for the sea level rise. That takes acceptance of the issue. Mitigation, working with the state and federal legislature to work on the carbon releases that are happening, building the walls to prepare, and then adaptation, which is redesigning the communities that we live in and that our future children or our children will live in, getting it prepared, pumps and panels and storing water and boats for public transportation. All those are things that are called adaptation. It also includes not building on the shoreline. It's like building on the side of a mountain. When your house falls off, why should you be surprised? I don't know. If we could actually just utilize those two words that they were talking about earlier, the common sense analogy, we actually could come up with some solutions and prepare.
Thank you very much. Sir?
Good evening. My name is Gregg Weiss. I am also running for County Commission District 2. And as it relates to sea level rise, I think the things that we need to be focused on, number one, is going to be saltwater intrusion. It's going to impact our water supply. Our well fields, currently we have well fields actually up in the north part of the county that are having to be moved because there is saltwater intrusion in those wells. It's costly, and so it's important we get started and we begin that process of moving those wells further away, because we're going to need fresh water. The other portion of this that's very important, of course, is the storm waters, getting rid of the water, because as the water raises out in the ocean, it's going to take not gravity to be able to deliver the water back to the ocean, but it's going to take pumps, and otherwise we'll continue to see flooded roads. Along our, the other thing we should be looking at is our septic systems. We have a lot of septic systems that are alongside our waters, both along our canals and along the ocean. When the ocean rises, those septic systems leach, putting things into the water that are not safe. And then I think we need to look at where we're going to get Sorry, I lost track here. Including building our beaches up for barriers. I mean, we have natural barrier islands. So when we're looking at our normal topography, and we're blessed here, by the way, in Palm Beach County with a better topography than our neighbors to the south. We are, in general, higher up than they are, so we have a little more time. But keeping those barrier islands there to keep the surges away from us.
Sure, thank you. Oh, saved him from the dreaded cowbell there. It was perfect timing. Thank you very much. And we're moving on to the Port of Palm Beach, District 5. But introduce yourself, and again, the office you're seeking. 90 seconds, same question.
Joseph Anderson, running for the Port of Palm Beach, group number 5. And I thank you guys for having this forum today to educate as well as for us to share our views. I think there's a number of things that we're currently doing at the port, which is number one, when we dredge, that sand is going to replenish some of the coastal beaches, whether it's Palm Beach Shores, or Singer Island. Second of all, I think we have to also not be counterproductive, because currently as we build, there's dewatering that's going on. And that water is actually going by gallons that are going to the storm water going out to the sea. So I think we also need to take a look at that as well. From the federal and state level awareness, we need to look at funding. We need to make sure that programs are put in place to, number one, educate, as well as number two, we need to bring some tax dollars home. As you all know, our infrastructure has a timeline. So with that timeline and you start to replace some of the infrastructure, let's start looking at building up our roads, which were mentioned. Number two, we also have to look at maybe a P3, a public partner-private to take on some of the burden, because when you really look at government, we can't do all the whole burden ourselves. So let's start looking at other corporations to see those are the ones that have received that message and are willing to partner up with local government, whether it's rebuilding. Also, let's look at some of the funding that is coming down for some of our harder hit areas, like some of our CDG, our community development block programs, and our neighborhood stabilization program. Let's start adding that component so they can raise their air conditioners, they can raise their disconnects and whatnot in order to address some of those areas that may be in floodplain areas. So I think with the collaboration of different efforts, also let's look at doing some continuing maintenance that municipalities are already doing, like making sure that their sediment is cleaned out in their stormwater drains. Joseph Anderson, running for the Port of Palm Beach, group number 5. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holtz.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Scott Holtz. I'm running for the Port of Palm Beach, group 5. I think the number one answer at all levels is that they all have to work together, because this is a problem that affects us here locally, of course, but is not limited to just Palm Beach County. It's a statewide problem, and ultimately it's a regional and national problem. And as a result, I think that the number one solution is we need to get the different levels of government talking to one another and working with one another to tackle this with one mind and one voice. Because those efforts need to work together in order to provide the best possible solution for the residents here in Palm Beach County. Now, specifically with respect to the port, I think we need to be focused on resiliency. I think the port needs to do a better job, and if I'm elected, I would work hard towards making sure the port is thinking not just 5, 10 years out, but 30, 40 years out in terms of what needs to be built up on the pilings, what needs to be done to ensure that the current structures at the port are ready for sea level rise, which we know is coming, which we know will ultimately affect the way the port is currently configured, as it's right on the water. So as that water is coming up, we need to be thinking strategically about where do we have to move things, if necessary, in the future to ensure the viability of the port. Furthermore, speaking as someone who lives locally just 2 blocks from the Intracoastal, I can tell you that my house, while I sit on the coastal ridge, my house, when I bought it, one of the features that my wife and I liked about it so much was that the foundation had been built up 3 feet above where it had been before. So again, where that comes into play is how do we, at the local level, state level, and ultimately the federal level, I believe, provide incentives and programs, rebates for homeowners to build up, and commercial business owners to build up their properties, again, to deal with the coming water. The fact is that I don't believe that we can just have everyone retreat. I think we need to ultimately figure out what we can do to make the current situation livable, and that includes things like pumps, building up the roads, and building up our structures. Thank you.
All right, and we'll begin as we did with the other group coming back down. We'll begin with Mr. Sansbury, move back down the way. We had a robust debate with our first group of state-level candidates about the fact that you've pointed out a number of things that need to be done, and it's not going to be cheap, and it's long-term, and that means money, and that means taxpayers, not only environmentally, but economically with their pocketbook, have a big say in that. All candidates, let's answer the question, what level of local funding, our organizers ask, would you put towards sea level rise resilience, and how would you fund it? And are you willing to commit and say, we're going to eventually, sooner or later, have to go to you and say, we need more of your tax dollars to make this happen? We'll begin with you, Mr. Sansbury, and work back down the line.
I think Mr. Sansbury yielded his time to me. So I'm Scott Holtz. That's okay. No worries.
Couldn't see down there.
That's a
My first there was Mr. Caruso. I couldn't see past him either. Mr. Holtz.
that's a great question. And look, what most people don't know about the port is that it is a special taxing district. The people who live in the boundaries of the port district, and for those of you who don't know, that's from the ocean to Lake Okeechobee, from Donald Ross Road to Southern Boulevard, and out west of 441, the line dips south to include Wellington, Belglade, and South Bay. It's a special taxing district that could ultimately, if need be, levy special taxes on the residents of that district in order to provide for additional funds necessary for infrastructure changes, such as having to cope with climate change and sea level rise. Now, that being said, I don't think that that's necessarily necessary. Number one, I think the port should be dedicating a percentage. An exact percentage, I don't have that answer yet. But I do think a percentage of its budget towards looking at how we're going to address climate change and sea level rise, and how we can address the issues of resiliency that I pointed out. I would add also that going forward, our port is a landlord port, meaning that the activities at the port are conducted by private tenants who lease space, physical space at the port. Going forward, I think we can build a lot of those costs into those leases to put the onus on the companies who are enjoying the benefits of being at the port and the economic activity at the port, without forcing the residents of the port district to shoulder that burden either entirely or certainly alone.
All right, thank you. Now, I apologize for putting my back to a few of you, but now I can actually see all the candidates sitting there, so my vantage point is better. Same question to you, sir.
Okay, thank you again. This is Joe Anderson running for the Port of Palm Beach, group number 5. The port currently has an interlocal agreement with City of West Palm, Riviera Beach, Palm Beach, as well as the county. So we also go out for block grants, whether it's custom border grants, and we help with their funding of their police departments and special, whether it's radar detector. Sometimes there needs to be a reciprocal agreement where we can go to them and say, hey, quid pro quo, you know, if we help you with this, we can also look for a reciprocal agreement and help them with sea level rises. That's one of the things. As well as taxing, I am against taxing due to the fact that the port is not taxed since 1915, if I'm not mistaken, because we are an independent taxing district. But there's other ways we can go about planning, having a 5, 10, 15-year planning when you start talking about raising the level of our streets in our port. We're currently helping the city of Riviera Beach with helping with their stormwater discharge, and we're treating that as well. So these are certain things we can do proactively, as well as looking at a plan long-term and starting to do it bit by bit. This didn't happen overnight, and we can't just have a magic wand and tax everybody to death to expect to get it done overnight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so obviously it's going to take more money to pay for these things, and I'm willing to go to the taxpayers and ask them. But I think it's beyond just Palm Beach County. It's beyond just South Florida. It's, as was said earlier, I mean, this is not just the state of Florida. It's the whole country. And we need an administration that will, number one, accept climate change and sea level rise as being real, and be willing to put the resources there. I think it's beyond what we're going to be able to do locally. But I believe, obviously, we're going to need to put some skin in the game, and I'm willing to go to my constituents and ask for their support. As it relates, I mean, you know, the other thing we need to be doing is, as we're building something new, it needs to be built to withstand sea level rise. There's no sense to continue to build things the same way. I serve on the planning board for the city of West Palm Beach and have for the last 9 years. Every time a project comes in front of me that's where you're having multi-stories, I'm always asking, do you have a sacrificial ground floor? Do you move your utilities up off the ground? Do you have all of your infrastructure up off the ground? Because eventually that tide along the water is going to be coming inside.
Thank you, Ms. Sharps.
As a prior employee of Palm Beach County Water Utilities, It was my responsibility when I did the big projects and infrastructure projects to find the money to pay for those projects so that the taxpayers didn't have to pay for it. So we built a $58 million plant in Belgrade to replace the water that was coming out of Lake Okeechobee because the federal government said they shouldn't bathe in it, let alone drink it. So for that $58 million, I was able to get $33 million from the federal government, state government, and other sources. I do know right now that it has been approved by the government that Army Corps of Engineers needs to do studies. Why can't we work with them? Congress, if they will get up and do what they need to do, approve the money for that study, then we can work with them. And the Army Corps of Engineers, through the federal government and Congress, gave $48 million to New Orleans to move people from one area. That really happened. So I do believe before I go to anybody and ask for taxes to be raised, I would try those maneuvers first.
Mr. Morel.
Yes, I would ask them to raise taxes. If we have to, that's what we'll do. Pure and simple. We don't, I mean, everyone is trying to bypass the question, and the question is, are you willing to ask people to raise their taxes? The question is yes. We will raise your taxes or our taxes so we can all survive. Pure and simple.
Let me talk, there was a study out I read recently. It said part of the problem with climate change and its impact to sea level rise is it feels psychologically distant. And so it's hard for people to grasp that. We saw in Miami Beach, it wasn't until they started having the king tides and significant flooding all the time that they did come up with the money and have done a lot of work there. One of the gubernatorial candidates, the former mayor, has talked about that. Give us, just boil it down, because I know for me, I don't know about you, it's hard to sit here and say, okay, what's my county need to look like in 3 to 5 years in terms of infrastructure hardening? Because what seems distant really may not be. So Mr. Morel, we'll begin with you. For our audience here, fundamentally and simply, the blueprint, what are the things you would put in your 3 to 5 year plan, then let's say your 5 to 10 year plan, then maybe 10 years plus, physically in terms of infrastructure changes that people will see, feel, in terms of making this community more resilient to sea level rise. Boil it down very plainly and simply, if not for them, at least for me. Go ahead, Mr. Morel.
I went to high school in Miami Beach on Prairie Avenue. Back then, of course, it was before electricity, for those who don't know. There was no water coming onto Collins Avenue. I mean, my friends and I, we played down South Beach all the time. So what happened is we decided, the citizens decided, or the officials, they're going to destroy South Beach and build and build and build. And now we are paying for it. So what we need to do is let nature take its course, have its way, retreat the way it was.
But,
so we don't have to deal with this mess.
But nature taking its course involves many tens of thousands of lives and millions, indeed billions of dollars worth of coastal property.
Well,
so what specifically, to my question, is your 1 to 5 year plan on hardening? You say retreat. If that's part of it, fine. But what is your specific 1 to 5 year plan for hardening? What is your 5 to 10 year plan and beyond? Just very briefly, because you've really used up your time, but I don't think I really heard an answer there.
My plan would cover however long it takes, is to stop building, stop allowing construction on the coast, and to just get people to start thinking about retreating, and that will help everybody.
So that would be part and parcel of your plan. A moratorium on building on the coast.
Correct,
sir.
Correct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morel. Ms. Sharp, same question. Be as specific as you can if you have that blueprint in your mind of what Palm Beach County should look like 5 years out in terms of infrastructure. Mr. Morel has very eloquently and passionately talked about part of his prescription. What's yours, 1 to 5 years out, 5 to 10?
Okay,
tangible, real things we should see.
Okay, 1 to 5 years out, we should see replacement of the current infrastructure that we have, and definitely a new blueprint of the areas where the water goes to when it rains, the
and
drainage.
When you say infrastructure,
the drainage.
Primarily
I mean the pipes,
okay.
I mean the drainage, I mean everything. It needs to be replaced and upgraded. That's number 1 to 5 years out. And then 5 to 10 years out, as the developers come, because they're going to come, and then there's homes that's going to be renovated and torn down and replaced. Those homes need to be built with the climate change in mind. They need to be built higher. The infrastructure needs to be able to support it. Those things have to be addressed when they're built, and that's a continuous thing. It's not an overnight solution, but it has to be continued.
Mr. Weiss, same question to you, sir.
Sure. So I think initially we need to be working on modifying our building codes to address the expected rise in sea level. Our well fields, we need a plan for moving those away from the coast and replacing them. We'll need a plan in the beginning to change our stormwater systems to deal with the flooding that we're going to be seeing from the storms that we have. Further out, looking at raising our streets, increasing our seawalls, looking at creating injection wells, and then further out than that, I mean, we really should have a 30-year plan as it relates to water in Palm Beach County.
Mr. Anderson.
Joseph Anderson, again, running for the Port of Palm Beach Group number 5. First of all, and I do agree with Gregg about the building code change, because that definitely needs to reflect the sea level rising as far as it pertains to building. Second of all, we definitely need to go from a port stance perspective. We also have to go to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, so we also have to get their approval. And also we have to go to the Florida Port Council, where there's approximately $85 billion that comes down and is disseminated to the 14 deep water ports. So these are some ways that we have to look at the funding, but also having a 5, 10, 15, 20-year plan when we start talking about renourishing or refurbishing our slips and our dredging and those things of those natures, where we have to look at that funding prior to. So these are some of the things that I think that are definitely in place, and also the preventive maintenance. Maintenance has to be something that's also intact as well as you start to build out, but also maintain.
Scott Holtz, running for the Port of Palm Beach Group 5. First of all, we all know that, or maybe you don't know, that Tropical Shipping is the largest tenant at the port, conducting the vast majority of the port's export business, which is the heart of the revenue at the Port of Palm Beach. So the first thing I would do immediately in the first 1 to 5 years is I think the port staff needs to sit down with Tropical and the other major tenants at the port and address their concerns and discuss in real terms exactly how the port is going to look with sea level rise on the increase at the low, medium, and high points in the near future, in the medium term, and in the long term, and then discuss the solutions there about how we need to address the infrastructure issues with them in order to make sure that they are able to continue to conduct business at the port, as well as keep the port an attractive place to attract new business when new opportunities come in to bring in new tenants. And then as far as dealing with the funding, I think we do have to be creative in terms of seeking out grant money and aid from the federal government, from the state government, from the Department of Transportation, for example, in terms of building up the roads, as well as the port's railway, which is one of the port's greatest assets, is its privately owned railway, or owned railway, that connects to the FEC train line. That's something else that would need to be addressed immediately.
Mr. Morel threw down the gauntlet, said we need to retreat from our coastlines, at least a building moratorium. But there are some, I said to a previous panel, there is a move afoot to look at sharply increasing the cost of insurance for people building along our coastlines. The argument is we continue to subsidize risk, and the risks are only going to grow with sea level rise. Do you share his view that we need to look at sharply curtailing coastline development in this county for the future as part of your 1 to 5 or 5 to 10 year plan? Brief answer, not a minute. Let's just run down a quick 10 or 15 second yes, no.
Well, I don't.
All right, we'll give you 30.
I mean, I'll be honest with you, Michael. That's not a yes or no.
In fairness, and we all know, and you're quite right, none of these are yes, no. We try simply to give a little bit of a flavor, and then we'll let them all grab you when we're done. But give me a little flavor. We'll go a little bit, but just briefly. Well,
I don't know how much of that deals directly with the role of the port commissioner, but fair enough. My answer is, look, I think that ultimately there is something to be said for trying to curtail or slow down development on the coastline, because it probably is not sustainable.
From a port, put it into a port perspective on how you look outbound at that huge economic engine and how it'll have to change. We need it It is a source of our economic vitality, and yet it's going to cost a lot of money to make sure it can be viable in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, depending on sea level rise.
Absolutely, but if I may, I think the real issue when it comes to climate change affecting the port beyond sea level rise is the impact of climate change on agricultural production, given that the heart of the port's revenue are agricultural exports coming out of the Everglades agricultural area, and the unforeseeable and unpredictable impacts on yields and types of crops and timing of harvest of yields of agricultural products currently grown and exported through the port.
Mr. Anderson, your thoughts as we look at what some call a retreat, a needed retreat, and talk a little bit more from the port perspective on infrastructure improvements. And where do you think we stand? Are we behind the curve right now in terms of the improvements we need at the port? On a scale of 1 to 10, where would be right now in your mind in terms of readiness?
As of right now, I believe we're 8 or 9 because the port has done quite well, being the fourth busiest port in the state of Florida and 18th in the U.S. Second of all, the port is landlocked because of interlocal agreements, right. So therefore expanding would have to go to a ratification of our current interlocal agreements, whether it's with the city of Riviera Beach or the city of West Palm Beach. But if we had to, I do share some sentiments with the building, and if we're going to build on the coast or areas that have not been built on the coast, we may have to probably looking at it a different point of view. But if we will build, let's build where it will be sustainable and protect the coastline as well as it was being, and where it will not affect the sea level rising as well as it would prohibit any flooding.
To our commission candidates, let me put a slightly different question. To people who say, I already have trouble affording to live here with insurance and cost, and one of the questions from our organizers talks to some extent about this. It says Florida counties, we all know we can take a huge hit to our homes, and therefore many homes are damaged to property tax revenues. If I'm sitting here, any one of us sitting here saying, how am I going to be able to afford to live in Palm Beach County in 20 or 30 years when it's tough enough now? What are we going to do concretely to help our residents, and no pun intended, weather the storm, weather sea level rise, where this can remain a resilient place, but also a place that's affordable as well? Mr. Weiss?
So, I mean, I guess the issue is with insurance, as it relates to insurance, and I mean, it's really a subsidy where we're all buying in and going into a pool, and I think what we're going to need, though, we need some sort of subsidization for those that can't afford it. I mean, we have a lot of people, especially in District 2, that are very low-income people, and they simply can't afford an increase. So we're going to need our state government to step in and provide that backstop for them. Living here is very expensive. The affordable housing crisis is real, and we need to be looking at new ways of dealing with that. One of the things I've talked about doing is looking at some of the areas where we have underutilized land, like where some of our old shopping centers are. Those shopping centers are dead. People are not using them anymore. And looking to turn those into mini town centers where you have mixed use, where you have both commercial and residential uses, where people don't have to get in their cars and drive and create more carbon and more pollution, where they're on transit lines so that we have shared transit that we can utilize. So I think we need to start getting smarter about what we're doing and how we're doing it, but we can build those affordable homes for people in this county if we set our priorities straight.
Ms. Sharp.
I agree. Our priorities have been wrong for a very long time. Education is key, period. Even if, say, you get a company to come here that's going to offer better paying jobs for the people that live here so they can afford the homes, you still have to make sure that the education is available for the people to be able to afford to get. That's key. They're all tied together. The education is tied to the workforce housing. The affordable housing is tied to the decisions that's made by the county commission and state with the developers, as well as the building fees and the fees that come out of Washington for the materials that you build the houses out of. So it's all tied together. And those things need to be looked at and determine whether or not we can make changes where it's necessary and then make it.
Mr. Morel?
scientists, environmentalists, and anyone who lives within 100 miles of the winding Mississippi River will tell you that attempts to tame that river have made it more feral, have made it worse. And the point is this: are we willing to keep fighting nature? Eventually, nature always wins. The question is, are you willing to pay the price? I'm not willing to pay the price. That's it.
Audience questions. We'd like brief responses here. We'll try to have a few of you answer. We've got enough that we're not going to go through all 6 of you with the same one unless you're just saying, I absolutely must answer that one. But one audience participant said, and that's strictly because of time, said this question from the audience: tourism and agriculture harvest billions in Palm Beach County. How do you plan to tax those two industries to address our climate change and as it ties into sea level rise? Who'd like to tackle that question? Don't all jump up at once. Go ahead.
Say that again, please.
The audience question: tourism and agriculture harvest billions in Palm Beach County. How do you plan to tax those two industries to address our climate change?
We should tax them as the needs arise. If we realize we have the need to tax them, and we should tell them, hey, this is what we're going to do. The problem is nobody wants to answer straight questions. Everybody wants to wiggle their way out. If there is a need, here's a perfect example. Recently, the county commission entered into agreements with Bentner Farms and others for them to list the ag reserve. To me, Bentner Farms, which I approve, I believe they should be there, but what they got was a sweet deal. We should have charged them more. So maybe we can go back and say, hey, we didn't charge you enough.
Let me ask, put another question. Growth management, this questioner asked from the audience. Growth management, yes, briefly.
I did just to respond about taxing our agriculture. I mean, that's food. That's what we use to feed our people and people all over the country. If we want to help the people who don't have the means, the last thing we want to do is increase the food prices for them. Everybody's got to have, has got to eat. And I mean, quite frankly, we're blessed to have agriculture in our backyard where we can have fresh food and fresh fruits here. I mean, that's one of the beauties of Palm Beach County. And but looking at increasing a tax is just increasing the cost to people who can't afford it. So I think we really need to think about whether that's from a policy perspective that makes any sense.
To our commission candidates, a question from the audience. Growth management, this questioner asked, is no longer a priority ever since the Department of Economic Opportunity, DEO, replaced the Office of Community Affairs. Do you have any plans to regulate growth, to fight sprawl, and focus on redevelopment so that our green areas can be protected?
My answer? Oh.
No, let's first, you can have an answer, but go ahead, ma'am, first. Let's share the microphone there.
Yes.
And all 3 of you will have a chance to, go ahead, ma'am.
That office
Yeah.
needs to be reestablished, and there needs to be some control. And yes, I support control.
Sir, briefly, same question.
Yeah, I oppose, I shouldn't say I oppose, but I'm not a sprawl person. I think I just indicated earlier, I'm for redevelopment and infill. I think that's where we should be focused.
Sir, Mr. Morel.
I've been fighting against GL homes for many moons. I'm against this idea of building every piece of green space they want to build upon. To me, enough is enough. These companies, I mean, it's all about the mighty dollar. They don't care about anybody else. So the answer is, I will put an end to it.
Question for all of you to tackle briefly because we just have a few moments left. But many unified local mitigation plans, our organizers ask, are geared towards shovel-ready projects but do not take into account hardening for sea level rise. What policy changes would you enact to ensure that they do? Anyone for that? Again, many unified local mitigation plans are geared towards shovel-ready projects, but don't take into account hardening for SLR, sea level rise. What policy changes at the county level would you enact to ensure that they do?
I would want to listen to what the scientists, the people who know about it, because I must confess that I don't know much about it, but there are people who do, and they're the ones that we need to follow. And this idea that we can continue business as usual needs to stop because it's not working.
And to our port candidates, perhaps there's a spin you can take on it from the port perspective. This question from organizers, considering, especially as you talked about agriculture and its vital importance to the health of the port and its vital impact, considering the current and future impacts of sea level rise, what markets might we invest in to promote growth, entrepreneurship, and economic development? You want to tackle that from a port perspective? You touched on it to some extent about what we've got to be aware of in terms of the markets that port serves. What do you look at in 10, 15, 20 years from now? Tackle that one for us, gentlemen.
One of the biggest things we'll be advocating and making sure, or just taking off of the shelf, is the inland port, especially when you're looking at some of the the economic conditions. So the inland port, from a logistics standpoint or logistics center, that is something that definitely would alleviate traffic as well as add jobs and opportunities in that area. Also from the coastal area is the revitalization of the Broadway corridor. That area is in desperate need of being revitalized so to increase tourism, such as whether it's a parking garage where we could actually partner up with the city of Riviera Beach and share the parking, which creates more lay-down space, as well as hotels, shops, and things of that nature. Looking at some of our dilapidated warehouse district, we have the old shopping, the swap shop, if you remember, on 13th, that is set dilapidated, attracting distribution centers and things of that nature. So there are some things that we can do from our standpoint at bringing back businesses that were there, such as the bowling alley, Clock Restaurant, and those other things.
Mr. Holtz?
Well, I took the question a little differently. I am also in favor of reviving the inland port of the Inland Commercial Distribution Center, and as I live on the Broadway corridor, I'm all for revitalizing the economic activity along the Broadway corridor. But as far as investing in new markets, I think that, again, as I said before, one of the concerns I have long-term for the port is the ultimate health and the effect of climate change on our agricultural industry, upon which the port is so dependent for its export revenue. Now, where is that export going is a good question too, because the majority of those exports are going to the Bahamas and the Caribbean, and the islands in the Caribbean, all of whom face even perhaps more dire consequences from sea level rise than we do even here in South Florida. So, given that our export markets, the markets that we export to, are going to be affected ultimately by sea level rise, number one, I think that what we need to do as in terms at the port is look to diversify the revenue streams at the port, particularly by trying to increase import activity at the port, and again, invest money now into developing relationships with markets outside of the Caribbean basin that the port currently serves that will not be as negatively impacted by sea level rise, and ultimately diversify the pools of money from which the port can generate revenue.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The market that needs to be thought about right now is hemp. Hemp. Yes, you heard me right. Hemp. That's where we need to go. Because there are so many. See, we are such a foolish people. We've allowed the government to literally destroy us when hemp was in our food supply. There are diseases that we did not get.
Tie this into sea level rise.
Well, very well. Yes.
As a market, you're saying?
Yes, you can. If you will ship it, and not only that. Now, if the Caribbean nations, if they're smart, they will start growing hemp.
All right.
And ship it here.
On that high note, we will. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. My wife says, "Why do you let him out of the house?" I want to say thank you. I know, and I'd say it to these candidates, I've said it to others, I say at the end of my one little plug for To The Point every week. We know that we only scratched the surface, but it's important to get the flavor of where you stand. We can't thank you enough, but I mean this from the bottom of my heart. For all of you on a weekday night to come out and start to have a better sense of the nuance of where these candidates are on an issue so vital, we all salute you. We'd like to let our organizers who put together this wonderful event close out with a few words, so give us your forbearance, and we thank all of you for your time. Sir?
Thank you, Mike.